Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Roundtable Death Café. My name is Sarah Kiskaden-Bechtel, and I'm the Program Director for the Completed Life Initiative, and I'll be your host today. At the Completed Life Initiative, we promote self-determination and dignity at the end of life. If you are new to our event programming, please feel free to explore our video archive on our website after today's event at www.completedlife.org. We would also like to extend many thanks and much gratitude to Reimagine End of Life for co-hosting this event on their summer calendar. For more events through Reimagine, please visit their website, letsreimagine.org. The first half of today's roundtable features three incredible panelists: Gail Rubin, Amy Cunningham, and Harvey Newman. These panelists will discuss how death cafes work to destigmatize the subject of death and dying through small group conversations, and how these events and our attitudes about death may have changed since the COVID-19 pandemic. For the second half of today's event, our audience will be assigned into small private breakout rooms, each of which will follow the traditional Death Cafe model of participant-led discussion. Whether you are new to our Completed Life community or are a returning attendee, we invite you to ask and think about lots of questions. These sessions are invaluable tools meant to empower you to have an informed conversation for yourself and with your loved ones about the question, what does it mean to live a completed life? A little background on our speakers. Gail Rubin, CT, which represents certified thanatologist and not the state of Connecticut, also known as the Doyen of Death, is a death educator who uses humor and outside-the-box activities to get people to plan ahead for our 100% mortality rate. Her motto is, quote, "Talking about sex won't make you pregnant. Talking about funerals won't make you dead." Gail is the author of 3 award-winning books, and she is the coordinator of the Before I Die New Mexico Festival, and also the pioneer of the Death Cafe movement in the United States. Amy Cunningham is a licensed funeral director and celebrant in Brooklyn. She is the owner of Fitting Tribute Funeral Services, which specializes in natural burials, delayed transfers, home funerals, and witnessed cremation services. In February 2018, Women's Health magazine gave Amy the unique moniker Death Ritual Disruptor, in a piece about how daily death contemplation and awareness can enrich our lives and keep us healthier. She was a reliable resource to news reporters throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and most recently was named one of the 50 most, fascinating people in Brooklyn. And last but not least, Harvey Newman is an interfaith minister who became interested in the human potential movement when he trained with the Church of Humanism in 1974. Seeing a need for interfaith to become a respected alternative to organized religion, he co-founded and was the first chairperson of the Association of Interfaith Ministers in 1985. In 2005, he became the founder and facilitator of Circle of Life Mastery Incorporated, a 501c3 devoted to the expansion of human consciousness. During the COVID shutdown, he began attending Nancy Gershman's Death Café NYC, and later took over the position of host from Nancy, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. All right, so before we begin, please be aware that you may input your questions into the chat feature located on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We welcome your questions at any time throughout today's event. And at the end, we will turn your questions for a closing Q&A with our panelists. Also, if you'd like assistance with closed captioning, you may toggle on the box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and that provides captioning for the spoken words of our event today. Finally, the recording of today's event will be published after the event concludes. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And to those of you in the audience, thank you so much for tuning in today. And thank you, Harvey, Gail, and Amy, so much for joining us. We're delighted to have you on the Completed Life stage today. So let's begin. So first, let's start with you, Gail. So in your experience of running Death Cafés, what is the significance of the Death Café model to you? And perhaps how has their importance grown in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I first found out about Death Cafés early on when John Underwood held his first in London in September of 2011. And I think he might have gotten some news coverage about it that I picked up here in the United States. And I said, I want to know about this. So I actually reached out to him and had the honor of having a Skype conversation with him before Zoom became really popular. And he was thrilled to be talking to the doyen of death. And for those of you who don't know, a doyen is a woman who's considered senior in a group who knows a lot about a particular subject. I've been doing this for 12 years now and going on 13. Oh my God. And he was so excited about the idea that people outside of England would want to pick up this Death Café concept and bring it to the United States. Lizzie Miles in Columbus, Ohio, a hospice worker, actually beat me to it, but I was glad she did because she held hers in July of 2012. And in August of 2012, I was going to Columbus to talk to the Ohio Cemetery Association and got to meet with her in person and find out how her first Death Café went. And she was actually quite instrumental in setting up this structure about giving an overview of what the Death Café origins are and how the ground rules, which is, as you all may know, that it's a safe, supportive atmosphere to talk about mortality issues. Nobody's going to try and sell you anything or lead you to any particular beliefs. And that, you know, we're welcoming and open for all sorts of beliefs and backgrounds. So once I got my hands on that, I had my first Death Café in September of 2012 in Albuquerque. So first one west of the Mississippi. And it's been so important to keep this conversation going when the pandemic came. You know, it's weird. Right now, the pandemic is still going on, but it's like people have like, I'm done. I'm done with masks. I'm done with social distancing. I want to get back in person with people. But people are still dying. We have almost 500 people a day dying, and people are still getting sick, and people are still being hospitalized. And it is so important, especially when it first started, that we be able to openly talk about death, because it was on the news. It was in our inboxes. It was in our faces. And to be able to come to a Death Café, at least virtually, and everything pivoted in March of 2020 online, including me with my Death Cafés. But one of the benefits of that has been you're not geographically limited, like we are here online today from all over the place. So it's been a blessing to have the Death Café model, to be able to welcome people to talk about death. And, you know, that's my motto: talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about funerals won't make you dead. and I'm living proof of that. So I'm so glad that we're able to have so many people join in this conversation. It's needed for our mental health to be able to take death out of the closet and talk about it honestly and openly.
Absolutely. And especially the pandemic has opened up that door of confronting us very directly, and perhaps painfully so, but at least as a community, we can come together and talk about it together. So thank you so much, Gail, for your opening. Thank you. So let's turn next to Harvey. So I'm curious, Harvey, in your experience, now that Gail has welcomed us to the space of the online, you know, host of talking about Death Cafés, what are some of the challenges perhaps in adapting Death Cafés to an online format and also the benefits?
Well, up until the pandemic, I had been involved in going to someone's home and sitting around having tea and cookies or biscuits or whatever, and with this very small group of people. But it was very, very helpful for me during that period of time. That was the time before my sister died at the age of 65 of dementia, and so that was really my real understanding of what a Death Cafe could be like. Um, while I was stuck in West Palm Beach, which is the place that I decided to take my wife when she started her um, road to dementia, which we know will end in death. I discovered that Nancy Gershman was running these death cafes over Zoom, and so I started going to attend those instead. And it was really good. It was really helpful for me to kind of get a handle on what was going to be happening with my wife. And then when she decided that she could no longer continue doing it and asked me if I would be willing to do it, I was very honored to be given that opportunity, and I've been enjoying it tremendously. One of the things I've noticed during this pandemic is that there are basically two classes of people: people who are languishing during the pandemic and people who are thriving. And I fortunately was one that was thriving, and so this was very easy for me to handle. A lot of people who come on are not doing as well during the pandemic, and so it really gives them an opportunity to talk about how they feel about their own lives, but then also considering, mortality as something to also talk about and their concerns and fears.
Thank you. One of the If you're familiar with the term hashtag on the internet, it's a way for different social media um, avenues and channels to have people connect with each other over a specific topic. And there's been one hashtag in particular that's come to my attention, which is hashtag death positivity. And the element of really grappling with your mortality is certainly evident in what I'm hearing you talking about, Harvey. So I'm curious, from your experience with death cafes, have people embraced, hashtag death positivity? And what are your thoughts on that?
I find most of the people come off of a session, it lasts about an hour, with a much more positive attitude. In fact, one woman who was at my last one, who had just attended one before, was talking about her grandmother who was dying and her inability to communicate with her. Well, she came on the second one and she said because of the Death Cafe discussion that we had, she was much more open to just listening to her grandmother, and she found out some wonderful things as a result. So I think that this is really the best that we can do is get people to feel more comfortable with it, and that will lead toward that positivity that you're talking about.
Thank you. And let's turn to Amy. So have you also seen attitudes and energy shift around discussing, life and death, especially in the wake of the pandemic? How, in your experience, can death cafes help us reflect on these important issues? Oh, I'm sorry, Amy. Let's unmute you.
Thank you. I think anyone who was fortunate enough to go to a death cafe prior to the pandemic or attend a workshop on funeral planning or lecture on eco-friendly modes of disposition and funeral advanced planning, those people prior to the pandemic found themselves, I think, in a little bit of a better emotional situation come March 2020, when death was less remote and right in our faces in the headlines every day, and how frightening it was here in New York City to go through the spring of 2020. I became a funeral director in 2012, just around the time Gail was starting her death cafes in New Mexico. And at the time, my training was so rigorous, and I found myself losing sleep. And in the effort to become a licensed funeral director, I endured and weathered a kind of stress that was previously unknown to me as a magazine journalist. And I would often ask myself the question, because I was so filled with a desire to enter the death care space and become a funeral director. I would sometimes ask myself, why am I doing this? What is driving me? It seemed mysterious. And come the pandemic, I had the epiphany that I think others on this call also had. It's like, my God, here's what I was preparing for. I'm in the right place at the right time. And I think all Death Cafe attendees had a feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm a little bit more ready to contemplate end of life issues and help people in my family, in my friend group, manage the stress of all this. So that was a really, as sad as the pandemic was, as tragic as the many losses we witnessed, there was kind of a spirit of we're figuring out how to live. And I love the name of your initiative, the Completed Life Initiative. I think many of us began to enter into a space of gratitude, of readiness, of, it's so hard, but a feeling of maybe not feeling positively toward death, but feeling like I want to live the best life I can in preparation for my inevitable demise. So I'd love to talk about the grief pandemic that we are now mired in. The New York Times reported that there are 5 million Americans now in mourning, and 43,000 children who've lost a parent in the last few years. And death cafes today, going forward, I think have a real great contribution in helping people talk about transition, separation, death, and even a larger kind of a way of defining it, how to cope with change, grief about the climate crisis, grief about gun violence, our political situation. All this is not directly related to the conversations we have in death cafes, but I think the other leaders will acknowledge that all of this kind of comes up.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Amy. I really appreciate that, especially, a lot of grief surrounding, March 2020 COVID hits, even though it had the virus had been looming, since December of 2019, when I remember, folks at the CDC and Department of Health saying, well, we're watching this virus and hoping it doesn't spread. And then, of course, it did. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on all of you. the role of anticipatory grief in contemplating, what it means to live a good life and then also to have a good death. Because suppose, you have someone, a loved one or a friend who has COVID and is critically ill, or perhaps another disease like cancer, and you have fair warning in a sense that, there is time left with that person, but that time may be limited. May have days, weeks, months to connect with that person, and for for yourself and for that person, what does anticipatory grief look like, and how does it contribute to the process and the experience in that time?
Yeah, so I mentioned that we were down in West Palm Beach when the pandemic started, but actually from 2016 all the way till the time that my wife died in 2021 last September, um, being the host of Death Cafe was very helpful to me to understand the process that I was going through and that she was going through. The last year that we spent, over a year, was about a year and 3 months of her being in hospice care in the apartment, um, was very, very helpful to me to get through that period. And I learned so much about her and myself. And yeah, I think I mentioned last week, she even gave me a rehearsal 1 month before where she woke up that morning and said, "I'm dying today." And I called hospice. The nurse came over, the chaplain came over, and we were pretty much certain that she was going to die that day. And instead, it took about another month before the actual death.
Mm.
And just before she died, a friend of mine sent me a wonderful article about not rushing to get the body out of the house, and I was so happy to get that and read it. And I spent at least a half hour with her after she died, just being with her, getting her settled for the funeral directors to come and take the body away. But I sang a song to her, which she always loved, and I just had this sense of completion by the time it was over, that she was ready to go, and I knew that I was going to fulfill all of her wishes, which she had already given me. Initially, when she gave me her wishes, she said, "If I should die," and I laughed. I said, "Why are you laughing?" I said, "Because that sounds like the children's prayer. If I should die before I wake, I pray the soul for God to my soul to take." Um, so, so I said, so she corrected herself, "When I die," and then she told me exactly what she wanted, and I was able to do that for her after she passed. So yeah, anticipatory death is really an important one to discuss with people.
Thank you, Harvey, so much. That's such a beautiful share, and I'm so sorry for the loss of your wife, and but it, the process you went through sounds truly meaningful, and it reminds me of different practices and rituals of staying with the person's body after they've left their body, and either singing to the room, or reading prayers, or reading passages in books, or even cleansing the body. Amy or Gail, any thoughts? Sure, Gail.
Yeah, I had a brush with my parents. Well, actually, my entire Florida family got COVID, January of last year. And my parents were hospitalized, and then they had to be in a skilled nursing facility to recover. And that was the point where we, as a family, realized they really need to be in an assisted living facility, that staying in their little patio home in Florida with my younger brother living there too, taking care of them, wasn't working for anybody. And it was a major upheaval. And, you know, we weren't sure if they were going to make it through COVID. My parents are in their early 90s, but I mean, God love them, they're both still alive and kicking and still have their wits about them. But, you know, physically, there are challenges. And that episode where we didn't know if they were going to make it out of the hospital, that's when I realized after we talk on the phone every time with my parents and my brothers, and we never did this before, we make sure we say, I love you. Very important lesson about, you know, death staring you in the face is you want to make the most of every day, and you want to tell the people you love that you love them every chance you can, because you don't know when you're going to have another chance, if you might not have another chance. So I think that's one of the things about a death cafe also that helps us recognize that all we have is this moment right now, and we need to make the most of every moment. So that's the lesson that I got from the pandemic and our death cafe conversations.
Yeah.
I love it that even in the stories that Harvey and Gail have just shared, you know, witnessed by fellow wayfaring strangers, that death and stories about end of life issues unite us. You could take people from two very different political perspectives and get them talking about the deaths of their grandparents, and you would find such bonding, such humanity in these stories. So one totally cool thing that you guys know about death cafes is that you may be sitting down to have these deep conversations and sharings with folks you've never met before. And you leave the hour with a kind of levity and happiness and lightness that you just didn't know was in you. So that's an inspiring part of the practice we engage in.
Thank you, Amy. Absolutely. We have a couple of questions coming in from our audience, so I'll turn to those and then we'll carry on. Rhonda is wondering, have you found the COVID-19 pandemic brought about more people preparing for their loved ones, like their wishes now in the event of their passing soon to come?
Yes, every funeral director I know has reported increased telephone volume and interest in arranging in advance, having conversations about pricing and so forth. I don't yet have a statistic on that, and that would be interesting to find. But I checked the industry polls today, and the number was out of date, but everyone's saying we're hearing from people.
I see. And then also Melissa was wondering about, earlier mentioned, Amy, that stat about the number of children missing a parent. If I think she would be very interested in that piece of information, either now or later.
Yeah, I'll give you a link, but I think if you Google grief pandemic, New York Times, it'll pop right up.
Thank you.
And despite, you know, great advances in medical care, humans do still have a 100% mortality rate, but less than 30% of adults do end-of-life planning. That's including advanced medical directives, pre-need funeral planning, getting insurance, financial planning, wills or trusts. So, you know, 70% of our loved ones are going to be stuck scrambling to get information and make expensive decisions under duress of grief. And I think the pandemic has caused people to at least start checking into what they need to know before they go. But we have a long way to go in terms of getting people to pre-plan their funerals.
Absolutely. Thank you for raising that point, Gail. And you're absolutely right. You know, mortality is inevitable for each of us, which I know is more of an uncomfortable truth for some than for perhaps us here today. But really, to work to spread, spread the conversations, open the doors to having that safe space to have these conversations is why I believe the Death Cafe is so important.
Yes,
Does
whenever
that,
the question comes up about it, I always talk about my mother, I'm sorry, my mother, who planned all of it before, and how much easier it made it for me to handle. I mean, I was the only surviving member of the family, and it just made life much easier for me to handle. And then also, my wife and I, many years ago, took out the insurance for our death planning, and that made it very easy for me to handle my wife's passing.
So I was going to ask Gail, I remember you mentioning that 30% before, and I was wondering if there's any chance it had gone down since the pandemic. Maybe not.
I don't think it's made much of a dent.
Okay.
Still
There you go.
pretty much up there in that 30%
We're
range.
just a species of denial. That's the way we are.
Yep.
I wonder if also if it's a lack of confidence in the funeral business and a feeling like you're gonna have a send off that you're proud of. I think we're working as an industry to show people, like the slogan at Burger King, you can have it your way. That there are new possibilities in end of life planning. And when you think about music or, your photographs or what you were here on earth to do and how you did with that mission, by and large, those things will excite people and feel like, gosh, maybe my funeral could be a nice thing. We need to help people see that it's an opportunity, not I was going to say death sentence. That you can die complete, that you can die with a message, that you can show the world who you were and feel like, God damn it, I'm dying, but here's what I want to say to you guys,
and Amy, to your point, how can living well inform a good death? And how can this space, help that 70% that Gail mentioned, who are maybe allocated to that duress of grief of, oh my goodness, I haven't planned for this. I haven't even talked with anyone about it. I haven't even thought in advance of what I myself might want. How can Death Cafes help everyone within that, group of people and others as well who are maybe a little more ambivalent, figure out, what does a good death look like for me? What are your thoughts?
I think just more of the same, more good efforts to show people pictures of and films. Films are so powerful. Having film festivals around end of life issues to show people dying with dignity. That's an exciting thing. And the more artists that come to the death space, many of them came to the earliest death cafes. I remember hosting one, and a painter came, and she said, I'm so happy to be here because all my life I've painted things about death and people think I'm morbid. And here I feel like I'm at home with people who can appreciate my work and see it as something life affirming and not so morbid. So the more we empower people who have things to say about how life is fleeting, how things are impermanent, and how hard it is to let go. that's what poetry and art have always addressed. And the more we show people that artists are welcome and new thoughts should come in, the better off we'll all be.
I'm so glad you mentioned art and film. We just had our second annual Summer Arts Festival, where we had we showcased different performances or films about
That's great.
essentially what a good death could look like and what the meaning of that was. And one that really stood out was Moon Manor. So it's publicly available on Showtime. So if you all haven't had a chance to check it out, go ahead and do so. It's definitely worth watching.
I watched it a second time after because it was just so good.
Oh, that's
But I
wonderful.
wanted to say that Gail's motto is such an important one to get out there. You know, talking about death is not going to kill you. It's actually going to help you understand how to complete your life in a much more meaningful way. So the more you talk about it, and I think it should be a conversation at any age.
So to Sherry's point in the chat, she's wondering, is there any research documenting the positive effect on mental health and or wellness overall of talking about, what a good death can look like, or, some might call it death care, for example.
There's that town in, I want to say Minnesota or Wisconsin, where like 98% of the people there have done their advanced medical directives. And part of that is that the society is enforcing it, that everybody is going to do this, everybody over the age of 18. And so the people who don't are sort of the outliers, and everybody is like comfortable talking about the topic. So I'm blanking on the name of the town. Anybody remember it?
I don't.
Oh darn.
That sounds cool.
Yeah. La Crosse, Wisconsin. Yes.
Nice.
Yes. And that's just part of the culture there. And I think people are happier that they've done that. And it is, 30% doing advanced care planning. Maybe that's creeped up a little more because I think there's been more of an effort in educating on there rather than the pre-need funeral planning per se. But I just recently myself, now I will tell you, I put my funeral plans on file with a local funeral home in 2015. So I did that 7 years ago, but we didn't prepay for it. And just recently I had a bit of a financial windfall. So my husband and I decided, all right, we're going to go get the insurance. We're going to pay for it, And actually what you do is you buy an insurance policy that pays the funeral home. So if you move someplace else and you need a different funeral home, you can change the beneficiary, but you have that money and it locks in today's prices with that funeral home. And, these are the kind of details that a lot of people don't even know about and is good to talk about in a Death Cafe setting, that, or in a Before I Die festival setting where it's transparency and openness and just an educational opportunity to learn about these details about dealing with death that society generally avoids. But I'm working to break down that resistance and change up the percentage of those who plan ahead.
So, to that point, do you think there is a lingering, maybe superstition is the right word, or, myth that talking about death would bring it on sooner versus not talking about death would stave it off and hold it at bay? it's a thread that's come up in the chat amongst our audience here. I'm curious what you think.
It's wrong.
Uh,
I've been talking about this for more than 12 years. So far, so good.
So Amy,
Yeah.
I see you're almost at the point of saying something. Go ahead, please.
Oh, I remember I did my residency at a firm in Brooklyn near Greenwood Cemetery that had a Roman Catholic following. And often when we brought a casket out and we were here in the city, you know, you move caskets over the sidewalk and sometimes have to check to make sure there are no pedestrians on the block. But when people would see us or catch us out there putting a casket in the hearse, folks in the neighborhood would cross themselves or acknowledge, you know, or look very frightened actually sometimes. And it was a real reminder of the anxiety so many people carry and what terrible daily fear they have of, you know, there, but by God go I. And that's a hard thing to break down, but I think just staying with them around it. And, you know, I always start with the music and try to get people to tell me who they were through the music they loved and the photographs that were meaningful to them. And you can slowly chip away at that anxiety and get them to see that this has a lot of merit. My own mother-in-law, my in-laws were terrified and so disappointed when I announced that I was going to leave journalism and become a licensed funeral director. I think they really thought I was in some sort of mental state of grief around the death of my parents, but that changed and they're so proud of me now and they boast to other elderly friends, you know, oh, you wouldn't believe what Amy does, and they laugh about it at the managed care facility where my mother-in-law now lives and giggle and want to talk to me. So I think a lot of people who are quite elderly are more eager to speak about these things than we give them credit for being. We, you know, tiptoe around it, but they're really poised oftentimes, I think, more often than not, to engage in real conversation, even if it's a little bit whispered at first.
Sure, of course.
There's a great deal of deep-seated beliefs and superstitions relating to it that creates this aura of denial. I was thinking about many years ago when my uncle died, who, first of all, he was going through a terrible time of suffering before he died, and I felt glad for his release. So when I went to the funeral, and I was in a very, very high state of mind myself. I had well, I don't know if we get into that, but in any case, I was really very, very complete with my relationship with him. And I'm sitting in the pew at the funeral, and a friend sitting next to me says, I don't know what's going on with you, but you're absolutely glowing." And I said, "Should I turn it down?" And she said, "No, I love it." And it gave me the first inspiration to think about funerals as being a place to celebrate life instead of mourn it and be grief stricken. Thinking about the joys of that person's life and their contribution to you in your life.
So thank you, Harvey. As you were sharing, what came to mind was, if you're familiar with Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead in Mexico, that's celebrated every year. And it's a large festival and celebration and feast for the family to celebrate their ancestors. And I'm curious, and Amy, to your point just a moment ago about, people really embracing this conversation and whether there are ways that we can help foster intergenerational conversations about dying and death. For example, the 16-year-old who's just gotten their driver's license and might be eligible to, sign up as an organ donor, right? Because you can list, oh, yes, I'm an organ donor on your driver's license. To have that conversation with their grandparent or parent. How can we help foster that further?
You know what? It's also a good opportunity to talk to the young person about what they might want, because you never know. They might be in a car accident and die. And that's why you put it on your driver's license, because that's when the hospital staff will look at it and say, oh, they're an organ donor, fresh organs. But the opportunity for that young person to say, oh, yeah, I'd like to be cremated. Yeah, maybe it might be cool to have a ceremony in the Japanese garden at the biopark. And that actually happened to a young man years ago who had an undiagnosed heart condition. And he had actually attended a service at this Japanese garden with his mother. And he said, yeah, I think I'd like that. And, just having that little wisp of an idea that this is what my loved one might want can be very comforting to a grieving family member, especially with an unexpected death. So, yeah, I highly recommend young people talk about what they might want, even at that point in their young lives.
I guess thinking about the deaths of young people is so upsetting to us all. And there's so many lessons embedded into the loss of a younger person, or a rupture when there's an accident, or it's just so unexpected and so searing. But that too is filled with the lesson that grief is not necessarily something you're ever going to get over. That these tears in the fabric of life, we hope that they don't happen, but when they do, it throws us. And even the most savvy death educator is going to be blown out until they find again that center of life's impermanence, the inevitability of change, how to turn tragedy into wisdom. All these themes also come up at Death Cafés, and these are the real hard ones. It's sort of like advanced death management. And I work with that and struggle with it as a funeral director myself, what to say to people when something like that happens. Mostly it's just about listening and giving that life value and meaning, and showing that that young person mattered, and trying to build an end of life ceremony that will acknowledge all that and look for the lessons and the teachings that we can all share. So it's good that came up, that we're talking about that, because that's really tough. And when some folks hear death positivity, they think, well, it wasn't so positive when my 4-year-old died. And so we need to sit with that and listen and heal.
Thank you for such a thoughtful, presentation of that. It's, it has so much sadness embedded in it, but also I really value your comment about just listening. And hopefully, most young people grow up and live a long, good life, and to the point where, at the very end of it, many decades beyond that point of getting their first driver's license, they can say, well, I've lived a good life, and can say I'm complete. So one of our audience members, Judith, was wondering about self-deliverance and how death cafes can help address this issue, and how this is approached in general, or perhaps individually based upon the Death Cafe. At the Completed Life Initiative, we're all about being a big tent to incorporate, not only to promote the question, what does it mean to live a completed life, but that each person's end of life experience will inherently be different from other people's and inherently unique to that person, in order to honor the dignity that they've lived throughout their life. And so, if they've chosen a self-determined death, for example, in contrast to the, sharp, traumatic example of, say, a car accident, how can we better grapple with and understand Judith's question?
Well, I think there are two elements that you need to look at. Self-deliverance as in medical aid in dying, where you have a terminal illness and rather than suffering through the end stages of the disease, you have self-deliverance with medications prescribed through a hospice. Or are we talking about hanging yourself, getting a gun and shooting yourself? There is a woman in Hungary who has been stalking death cafes, talking up killing herself, and she's in her 30s, and basically she's gotten banned from being in death cafes because she's basically, hey, let's kill ourselves. And it's like, that is not appropriate for the death cafe. So it is a topic that suicide is discussed, but with that one individual who wants to get on every death cafe she can to talk up this self-deliverance idea, it's very disruptive to death cafe conversations. So whenever I have my online death cafe, nobody from Hungary can participate. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Well, yes,
Go ahead, Amy.
I'll leave it to someone else.
Oh,
It's about control. People long for more control, right? I'll let someone else take it from there.
Something I do want to clarify is that, self-determination is very different from suicide, and they're often, unfortunately, conflated with each other. And part of the work that we do at the Completed Life Initiative is to really disentangle those two elements. And, suicide has a lot of stigmatizing connotations. It's often premeditated, but also can have irrational components, whereas self-determination is, along the lines of what Gail mentioned relating to medical aid in dying, is really looking at how do I have a thoughtful, peaceful death, and by that qualification, make it good. So I want to bring out that distinction. And also, I realize we're running short on time.
okay.
So just a last question from Sue. She's wondering if each of you can talk a little bit on how you might be working to increase, diversity, equity, and inclusion among the people that you work with and reach out to make these conversations more accessible to anyone and everyone.
That's been a great gift of recent years, and I think every one of us has engaged in an intimate soul-searching process to identify our own unacknowledged biases and ways of being into ourselves and people who look like us or something or agree with us. I think this is a major and so important part of our lives right now, and part of our effort to complete ourselves. And that's all I can say. I've looked over every word of my website. I've opened up as much as I can, and I still work on it really hard. And getting more voices into the movement, getting more teachers from different communities that haven't previously had a voice. All of this has been hugely important and such a blessing, such an opening to light in the last few years. So I'm grateful.
Beautiful. Thank you, Amy. Gail and Harvey, we just have a couple minutes. If you have anything to share, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll set up for the breakout rooms.
Well, just in the Death Cafe setting, it kind of depends on who shows up. But I have had, people from all diverse walks of life and different nationalities and religions. And so it's sort of a self-selecting process in the Death Cafe, depending on who shows up, how we have that conversation. But, I just keep putting the information out there and hope people grab onto it.
It's about the same for me, but it's really exciting to know that Zoom has made it possible for people from all over to come on, and I've had people from all different places at different age groups, and that is exciting to see. How we can expand it more, I don't know. If anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear.
Well, certainly, having these conversations is step one. So I'm so appreciative for your willingness to come on here today and spend some time really talking in depth and in a meaningful way about this important issue. So much gratitude to each of you. So briefly, before we jump into our breakout rooms, which will not be recorded and are we respect the privacy of each room. So what should our audience know in order to lead their own death cafes in the breakout rooms?
Yeah, to be open-minded and non-judgmental toward anything that anybody says, and keep it moving, and notice the humor that comes up, because it's very often there's a lot of humor that comes up in the discussions.
Thank you, Harvey. All right. Well, I don't want to take more time away from the breakout rooms. So by all means, let's commence. Thank you all so much again for being here today. It's been an incredible conversation. And I'll pause the recording now. So now that you've had a chance to experience your virtual Death Cafe today, you're welcome to raise a hand and share a highlight or a few thoughts about your experience today if you feel compelled. We just ask that you keep your share to between 30 to 60 seconds. So feel free to raise a hand and we'll call on you individually. And then we have time for about 3 to 4 shares, and then we'll conclude for today. So I see a hand by Deb. So let's unmute Deb and feel free to go ahead.
Hi, our group was small but powerful. There were 3 of us. One person dropped off because of a poor internet connection, but I'm excited to say that both of the people I talked with are looking forward to starting Death Cafes. This is a new endeavor for them. And we just shared we had a wonderful time sharing part of our passion and what brings us here and how Death Cafe can align with those passion, even though we may be approaching things a little bit differently. I, for example, am a past hospice nurse and I am an end of life doula. So I bring something in that category. I know Gail is fantastic in terms of planning celebrations and all the things around burials and funerals. So we all can offer something unique that still contributes through our Death Cafe affiliations. Thank you. I enjoyed the meeting today.
Thank you so much, Deb. And I really love the vibrancy of the pink around you and that you're wearing today.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much. All right, so let's turn next to Mim. Let's go ahead and unmute you, Mim. One moment. Oh, she's still muted. Okay.
No. I just felt so affirmed. It's incredible. There were four of us, and I felt very affirmed and very much on an equal basis with everybody on that in that Death Cafe. And I just want to say thank you, and thanks for the opportunity through CLI.
Thank you so much, Mim. I'm so glad that it resonated so beautifully with you. And I also really appreciate your serene coordination between your t-shirt and your background. It's a very peaceful looking space that you're in. So thank you for joining us. All right, let's turn to Nikki.
As an attendee, I just want to thank the host and co-hosts and the wonderful breakout group that I was in. The support I felt was just overwhelming, and can't thank you all enough. And thank you, Harvey, for guiding me here.
Oh, thank you so much, Nikki. I'm so glad it was meaningful. All right. Well, we have one last hand. Let's go ahead and unmute Mary.
Hi, I just really am grateful for the opportunity. And so I'm from Canada, and there was a lot of discussion around the similarities and differences between end of life options and different support networks in the United States versus here in Canada. And I really appreciated learning about those. And I got some really wonderful resources that I can't wait to check out based out of Florida, I believe. So I'm stoked on that.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Mary. And cheers to you up in Canada. Thanks for joining us today. All right. Well, thank you all so much for raising your hand and sharing your experience. It's so moving and meaningful to me to see you all here today and to be able to host this incredible group of panelists for our August roundtable. So it's now that we've come to a conclusion today, it's bittersweet, but we look forward to future events similar to this in the future. So thank you again all so much for joining us today. And we invite you to join our mailing list if you haven't already for the Completed Life Initiative, and to stay in touch with us. We often send email announcements regarding upcoming events. So that's the best way to stay up to date and keep our events top of mind. And also there's an events page on our website, www.completedlife.org, where you can also be notified about upcoming events. Just a shout out and look ahead towards future Completed Life events. There will be another Roundtable Death Cafe similar to this one, hosted in September. So stay tuned for that. And also we will host our third annual fall conference in October. So save the date for that, October 18th, 19th, and 20th. And if you're on our listserv, you'll certainly receive more information about that as time goes on. We also invite you to follow our panelists after the event today. Gail Rubin's website is agoodgoodbye.com, AGOODGOODBYE.com, agoodgoodbye.com. Amy Cunningham maintains a blog called theinspiredfuneral.com, and you can find her most actively engaged on Facebook and Instagram at Fitting Tribute Funerals. Harvey Newman hosts the Death Café NYC group through Zoom, which you can find on meetup.com as well. And once again, we would like to remind you to check out the rest of Reimagine's events schedule at letsreimagine.org. All right, so we've come to a close for today, and I want to thank our panelists once again for their incredible participation and interest in today's event. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, we would love to have you all back for future Completed Life events. But until then, be well, best wishes, and see you again next time. Take care.